us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. Hebrews 10:23.
In 1865, the American Civil War came to a close. It was in that same year that the first two Norwegian Lutheran pioneers, Terrell Thompson, shown here, and Johannes Uvas, moved into the area of what would later become Lake Mills, Iowa. 2 years later, Eberhard Christensen, a blacksmith, arrived in the settlement. He built a home and then sent for his wife and family, still in Norway. When a baby was born to the Christensens in June of 1870, a problem arose. There was no pastor or congregation in the community for a baptism. The Christensens' problem was solved when they learned that the Reverend Botoff B. Geldacher was going to hold services at Silver Lake on the last Sunday in August. Their baby and 16 others were brought for baptism that day in the grove of trees where Silver Lake Lutheran Church now stands.
When Reverend Geldacher learned there were other Norwegian Lutheran families in Lake Mills, he extended his service to the community. The first Norwegian Lutheran worship service in Lake Mills was held in 1871 in a two-story school building that stood in the middle of where Main Street is now located, just south of the corner stop.
Reverend Geldacher was a circuit-riding preacher who served gatherings of Norwegian Lutherans throughout the area. A letter written by him to Eberhard Eriksson of Lake Mills in November of 1871 included a schedule of Christmas services to be held by him in late December and January at Shell Rock, Silver Lake, Round Prairie, Lime Creek, and the Cleven School, which was west of the former county home. Reverend Geldacher and other early circuit-riding pastors traveled by foot or horse and buggy on dirt trails in the summer and used skis or snowshoes during winter months.
125 years ago this weekend, on October 2, 1874, Reverend Geldacher met with a group of men in a schoolhouse near the Rolof Kittelsen farm southwest of Lake Mills to officially organize the Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Congregation. As the congregation's first pastor, Reverend Geldacher agreed to preach 9 Sunday services a year at a salary of $100. Services were held in homes, outdoors, or in early schoolhouses.
From 1874 to 1876, Reverend Geldacher served the congregations at Lake Mills and Silver Lake. In 1876, Silver Lake called their own pastor. The Lake Mills congregation was then served by Reverend Ole Nelson, who also served congregations in Lime Creek, Shell Rock, and the New Luther Valley. The first Lutheran pastor to live in Lake Mills was Reverend Paul Osby, who was called in 1878. He served for 14 years as pastor of the Lake Mills congregation, as well as Lime Creek on the Minnesota side.
Reverend Osby recognized the importance of drawing up and filing articles of incorporation for the congregation. They were signed by J.M. Dahl, A.L. Osgard, and trustees Niels O. Stevie, George Nelson, and Herman Hagen. They were notarized on March 21, 1889 by P.M. Joyce, namesake of the town of Joyce.
Thanksgiving Day of 1882, Mrs. Eberhard Christensen invited a few women to her home to form a group that would work to raise money for the church. She had visited such a group at Silver Lake and felt her town needed a similar organization. This gathering of women marked the beginning of what would become Salem's women's organizations, known throughout the years as Kvindaforening, Ladies' Aid, WMF, ALCW, and Women of the ELCA. Pictured here is a Ladies' Aid gathering in 1936.
From 1882 to 1889, the congregation met in the Lake Mills School, which was located where the Methodist parsonage now stands.
In these early years, a cooker assisted the pastor with prayers and scripture reading. In 1890, he received a bushel of wheat from each family, or money in the same amount for his services. Olvie was the last cooker. He resigned in 1934. The Sunday school was first organized by a Mr. Nessheim, operator of the city elevator, who was superintendent during Reverend Osby's ministry. The forerunner of Salem youth groups today was Young People's Society, that was organized in 1895 to provide Christian fellowship for the youth. This group eventually became known as the Luther League in the 1940s.
The Lake Mills congregation in its early years belonged to the Norwegian-Danish Conference. During these same years, there were another group of Norwegian Lutherans in the area who were served and organized by pastors of the Norwegian Synod. In 1889, since there was still no Lutheran church building in town, the two groups agreed to build one as a joint effort. This United Lutheran Church was built at a cost of $3,200 on the lot where the current Salem Lutheran Church now stands. With the addition of a lecture room and furnishings, the total cost of the building rose to $6,000. The brass lamps located today on tables in the narthex first hung in this 1889 church building. This 1889 building had been constructed with the understanding that the two groups would use it on alternate Sundays. This sharing arrangement, however, was short-lived. Within a year, the Synod Lutherans withdrew to erect their own building in Lake Mills.
Reverend Niels Bruin of Chicago was installed as pastor in 1893 and served in Lake Mills for 20 years. In 1913, Reverend O.R. Sletton was called as pastor of what was still called the United Congregation. Reverend Sletton would become the longest-serving pastor of this congregation, remaining for 24 years.
In 1917, the Norwegian Synod and the United Lutheran Church merged with the Hauge Synod. The two Lake Mills congregations formed a committee to organize the new union and draft a constitution. Both pastors agreed to resign, and Reverend Sletton was then unanimously selected to be the pastor. It was Pastor Sletton who changed the name of the church from United Lutheran to Salem Lutheran. The word Salem is derived from the Hebrew shalom and means peace. Not all was peaceful, however. A minority of Synod Lutherans did not agree to the merger of their respected church bodies, and separated to officially organize the Lake Mills Evangelical Lutheran Church, also known as the Synod Church.
A Tracker organ was purchased by the early church. This organ now rests on the balcony of the Lake Mills High School auditorium. The first Lutheran Men's Brotherhood meeting was held in 1918. The first president was T.S. Tweed, with M.A. Osgard vice president. One of the high points in Salem church history took place in 1919, when the cornerstone was laid for a magnificent new brick edifice of Gothic architecture, the only one in the county. The architect for the church was Torvald Thorson of Forest City, Iowa, and it was built by C. Rye and Sons for $70,000, completely equipped. More than a few Salem members mortgaged their property in order to make four-figure contributions toward the building effort, and many years were required to pay off their debts. A church of this magnitude needed a pipe organ. The Lutheran Men's Brotherhood and Luther League contributed $7,200 toward the new $8,000 pipe organ. The Ladies' Aid gave $2,650 towards the art glass windows and electric light fixtures. The new building was dedicated on May 22, 1921. 21 pastors were present for the dedication, together with over 2,000 members and visitors. Only about half the crowd found room within the church.
In the 1920s, Reverend O. Hallesby, well-known theologian and author from Norway, agreed to preach in two places in Iowa that could hold large crowds. Jewel and Lake Mills were chosen. Over 2,000 people heard him preach at Salem. People filled the aisle, hallways, and even inside the altar rail.
Tuesday school religious instruction on time released from the public school was begun with the superintendent of schools, S.G. Reinertsen and Pastor Sletton, as the first instructors. Tuesday school continued until the spring of 1973. A controversy in the Sunday school department led to a special meeting of the deacons on February 2nd, 1921. It was learned that some Sunday school teachers and choir members had attended dances. The church adopted an ultimatum stating that, quote, if anyone is not willing to abstain from dancing, we request they resign from their office in church in order that their future conduct does not cause offense, end quote.
A former Salem member grew up to play an important role on the national Lutheran scene during these years. Dr. J.A. Osgard grew up in the Lake Mills community and Salem Church. He advanced to the position of president of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, a position he occupied from 1925 to 1954. It was under his leadership that a denomination of foreign-speaking immigrants was to be transformed into an English-speaking, Americanized church body. His firm but good-natured personality aided him in welding a strong, united church out of three groups that had merged in 1917. At the end of his administration, he played a leading role in bringing about the 1960 merger of the American Lutheran Church, or the ALC. He entertained the motion for adjournment in the final moments of the ELC convention in Minneapolis on April 21, 1960.
The Norwegian language was used exclusively for many years at Salem. In 1935, every other Sunday service was held in English. By 1937, all but a few special summer services were in English.
Reverend Joseph Knutson followed Reverend Sletton and served from 1937 to 1943. He would later become president of Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. He was followed by Reverend Howard Blagan from 1943 to 1946 and Reverend Thomas Bowe from 1946 to 1956. Pastor Bowe discussed the need for an altar guild. The group was formed in 1952 and has been an active group of servants in the church for nearly 50 years. In 1952, the decision was made no longer to list the financial contributions of individual church members in the annual report. In 1954, women received the right to vote in Salem church meetings.
Fundraising for a new educational unit was begun during Reverend Bowe's ministry, with construction beginning during Reverend A.I. Kwame's ministry. Reverend Kwame served at Salem from 1956 to 1966. The educational unit of 15 classrooms, chapel, 3 offices, restrooms, lounge, resource room, and storage rooms was dedicated on June 19, 1959. The church basement and kitchen were also remodeled at this time. The total cost of the educational unit and basement was $205,000. The picture shown here was the architect's sketch used on the Dedication Sunday Bulletin. A separate project in 1958 and 59 was the rebuilding and moving of the church organ and choir loft. The choir loft in the 1919 church had been located in the area where the organ pipes are currently housed. The cost of the organ rebuilding was $12,000, with an additional $3,000 paid to local carpenter Chris Nelson to build the new choir loft and housing for the organ pipes. Salem adult and youth choirs have added beauty to worship throughout the years.
It was during Reverend Kwame's ministry in Lake Mills that the congregation first began calling associate pastors. Associates who served with Reverend Kwame were Reverend Frederick Dahl and Reverend Kenneth Hatland. Reverend I.B. Sorensen was senior pastor at Salem from 1966 to 1975. Associates who served with Reverend Sorensen were Reverend James Quitno, Reverend Dennis Hefner, Reverend John Syme, and Reverend Paul Tweeton.
Pastor Dwayne Dalen was called a senior pastor in 1975 and served for 20 years. Working with him as associate pastors were Reverend Wesley Mathry, Reverend Dennis Hansen, Reverend Tom Isaacson, and Reverend Roger Dykstra. In the early 1990s, plans were made for the building of an enlarged narthex choir room, handicapped accessible restrooms, and an elevator. Total cost of the addition was nearly $500,000. Ground was broken in 1994, with the dedication taking place in the spring of 1995. In 1995, Pastor Dalen retired, and Associate Pastor Roger Dykstra was called as Salem's senior pastor. Pastor Sarah Beth Acri was called as Associate Pastor in the fall of 1995. WOW, a weekly after-school program for area children, was begun in cooperation with other churches in the community in 1996. Also in 1996, the Sunshine Christian Preschool was opened at Salem. In 1998, Jody Benorden was called to the new position of Director of Youth and Children's Ministries. In the fall of 1998, a weekly contemporary service, JC for You at 9:45, was begun in the chapel.
Many things have changed in 125 years of Salem Lutheran Church history. Many of those changes have been reason for joy and celebration. Some of them have been reason for sorrow and regret. But there is one thing which has never changed, and that is the faithfulness and promises of our Lord Jesus Christ. As we turn now to Salem's 126th year and the dawn of a new millennium, we do so trusting that He who has been our heritage will remain our hope, and that the new days we see will be days full of grace.